Welcome to the Highcast, the podcast where we chit chat, spill the tea, and some facts. I'm your host, Thais, and I'm highly happy to have you here. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Highcast podcast. Tonight, we're going to be talking about transition states, identity, and emotional maturity. So, to start off this episode, I wrote down a question that I like to, go dive a little bit deeper with you guys. Have you ever felt like internally your life already changed, but externally everything still looks the same? Yes. And I think it's such a difficult time to be in because you're not sure about anything, right? You're trying, you think you're on the path, but you have no idea yet. This in between phase, it's really weird and it feels there's like this waiting room energy. And it's the phase where your old self no longer fits, but your new self hasn't stabilized yet. Maybe it arrived, but it haven't stabilized yet. And I wanted to talk about this because this is the phase that I am currently in right now. And let me tell you, if you are going through this, let's give ourselves like a few seconds of silence. Yes, girlies. It's really hard because, I never really, I mean, I've heard people talking about this, but I never really heard someone talking about it while they're like in it, because I think it's so much easier to talk about something like this after you're like done and that everything already worked out for the best. But I think it's really important for us to share that like the process is not like guaranteed. And I think it's really cool that we're showing this. The process exists, and if you're in it, you're gonna be fine. But I think that maybe you're like wondering what this in between actually looks like in real life. And so let's say that you're trying to manifest something really big. And for you to be able to do that, you're probably gonna have to do a lot of like internal work as well. I think that is a part of manifestation that is not really talked about that much, about all the like you really have to break a lot of limiting beliefs. You really need to work on yourself. You really need to almost like train your own brain to like focus on exactly what you want. But usually for you to do that, you need to focus on what you accept, your boundaries or like your self concept. And when you actually start doing this and things starts to like fall into place and you start aligning, that actually tends to create a little bit of external chaos because it's like you are in your 3D reality, right? Like you're physically present and you can feel the misalignment because usually people are aligned with their external reality, and that's why they're in it. Start working on yourself, when you start working on what you want and what you accept from life, that like it's almost like an internal battle because you are it's almost like you're breaking yourself so you can rebuild, because it's really hard to really build something if you don't have like a stronger base. So that's where the chaos really starts. And it can look like you start having like you start feeling the detachment. I think that for me, that's the first thing that started happening, like I started to, step away from old friendships. I dropped a few jobs that really did not feel aligned with me and with who I was trying to become. To be honest, I feel like I'm a little bit, I feel like detached is a strong word to use, but I'm definitely not entangled with my family emotions anymore. And I think that's like when you really start to like see the misalignment, and it's really tough because it's like, what can you do? Because you're already in this reality, right? You can do much, you know, like outside. You can't really force anything. You need to, kind of like adapt to the process. And in this episode, I think I want to talk about maybe like some traps or maybe some things that are a little bit misunderstood, you know? Um, so I also want to talk about obsession versus embodiment because in this in between, it's really complicated because nothing is really stable, right? You know, you're probably losing friendships, maybe you're losing routines, maybe you lose a job, maybe you wanted an opportunity and you were so sure about it and then it falls through, like there's this sense of instability for a while, while you're in the middle of the transition. And that's where obsession and embodiment can feel a little bit like the same. And I started realizing that there's a huge difference between, intuition and emotional obsession. Because when you change and you start to feel, like I said, the misalignment, you start to get this like urge to check. You keep checking your 3D. You keep looking for signs. I talked a little bit about this on my previous episode where I talk about being a little bit obsessed with signs and external confirmation and validation. And that's a little bit dangerous because when you are obsessed with checking, because it's almost like you're like, okay, like now I am aligned with my desires. So when is it coming? When is it getting here? And you keep checking and you're like, oh my goodness, I just saw 1111. I just saw, I don't know, 555, and you really start obsessing over these little details. And usually that's a problem because obsession keeps you from taking action. Like you are so worried about like it's almost like you're hyper vigilant about like your environment and you're like waiting and expecting it to come. But when you do that, two things happen. First, you don't take action, because usually what takes you to your desired reality is aligned action and not just magic. And two, you start giving your external reality too much power over you. And that's usually a problem because if you're trying to manifest something else, you need to detach completely from your current circumstances. So you can give power to that because otherwise you're gonna be stuck. Like you're keeping yourself stuck by giving power to something other than yourself. And when you're acting like from this embodied state, you don't have to force anything. It's like when you are able to truly change your identity and not just your actions, you don't need to push, you don't need to force. Everything kind of like falls into place. And, like I am going through this like right now. And I think it's important for us to talk about this because when you are obsessed with signs and with the outcome, and you feel like you're not, so I think that's why it's nice to really like shine a light in that, because we need to wake up. It's like when we're going through this, it's like we already went through so much that we think we've done everything. But we always need to be awake, we always need to be aware, but not hyper vigilant. Because if we are just, if we're always expecting something to like any movement or something, like that gives anxiety, and that is really bad for our nervous system. Because things starts moving when we are able to leave our flight or fight mode, when we are truly able to like relax our body and trust ourselves. Like it's so much easier for us to listen to intuition, and then it's usually from the intuition that we receive that we are able to take aligned action there. And there are a few things that we can notice, like if we're acting and we're like, oh my goodness, is this obsession or is this embodiment? Obsession needs constant reassurance. Intuition feels quieter. It's a knowing. You just know. You know. Obsession hyper monitors reality. Embodiment keeps living and building anyway. That is another point. If you are in this obsession phase, you're too dependent on your 3D reality. So, for example, if you're having a really good day, you are able to keep like the energy high, your thoughts, in control and everything. But like, what about the days that everything goes to shit? What are you gonna do then? And last week, it was a really, really crazy week for me. I never felt like I was so tested in my entire life. It was insane. The entire week, it was like the universe it was giving me opportunities to really stabilize my new identity. I am someone that has to like deal with like stress, I guess. Like, for me, when I get stressed out, it really throws me off. I hate to be stressed out. But, like my current 3D reality, sometimes it kind of doesn't help me stay the most regulated. You know, I live in a building, there's a lot of people, a lot of noise, there's like gardeners almost every day, and kids running around, and everything is really loud. My neighbors are really loud. And, like last week, like I said, it was insane. Like every single day, something happened. Every single day, something did not go as planned or as expected. Like for me, one thing that is really important is my coffee. I make coffee almost right away after I wake up. And then like last week, like I was making my coffee, and like I do not know what happened, and like I hit the coffee thing and it spilled everywhere. And like when it happened, I was like, oh my. And I cleaned it up like it was nothing, even though it was. And then I was like, oh my goodness, like that, I'm so proud of myself. That could have been so bad. And then On Wednesday, something happened, and then on Thursday, something happened, and then everything that could have gone wrong. For example, I filmed last week for the podcast, and then I couldn't send the video to my computer, and then like I couldn't edit the video, and then like the accounts weren't working. I had a bank appointment that it didn't go as planned. Every single thing that could have gone wrong went wrong. Like it was just one of those weeks. But it was amazing because for the first time, I was looking at those, like situations, and I acted differently. Like usually I'm good at like understanding what happened after the fact. But last week, I started really understanding what was going on when it was going on. And because I was able to do that, I was able to act differently in the moment. And I didn't like attached any emotions or any feelings to the things that were happening. I didn't take those delays as an identity trait. When something minor happens in your reality, what happens is you usually attach meaning to that. So, for example, I, hit the coffee thing and it spilled everywhere and I had to clean it up. In that moment, there was two ways that I could have gone. I could have done what I actually did, but I could have been like, oh, holy shit, like this day is awful. Like, everything bad happens to me. Why the fuck is this happening? And that would have been so draining. It would have put me in the worst mood. It would have been so difficult. But instead, I just cleaned it up and then I figured things out. I had my coffee and I had a normal day. I noticed that it happened because, trust me, it was very noticeable. But I didn't react, I responded. There was a situation, it was already done. I was gonna have to do something about it anyways. And instead of putting energy into being like annoyed by the situation, I simply just cleaned it up and moved on with my day. But if you are trying to be something, like if I was trying to stay centered, maybe that would have probably been something like, oh my goodness, I'm trying so hard to keep this identity, and then all of these shitty things happen to me. But because I was actually embodied, I was embodied with that new identity, I simply acted like my new identity. And I think like that is the biggest difference, because at the end of the day, your actions and your responses is really what like changes your life. It's like the way you see things, the way you perceive things, that's what creates your reality. And if you are someone that like doesn't make a big deal out of things, someone that doesn't attach meaning, especially like bad meaning to something, your life is much more likely to unfold more easily than if you're creating resistance. Something else I think is so important throughout the journey is about nervous system stabilization. I honestly think a lot of people are trying to manifest from a dysregulated state. And I think that is really complicated because it's frustrating. That was me for a very long time because, as I mentioned before, when I started my manifestation journey, I wasn't really looking to change myself. I wanted to change my circumstances. But I learned that I cannot change my circumstances if I don't change who I am. Because if you think about it, the person you are currently is what created your current circumstances. So if right now you're somewhere that you're not really you don't like it, or that you're unhappy, you're unfulfilled, like the person you are right now is the one that created that for you. And you have the power to change it, but you can force reality to change, because reality will only change if you change. We basically have this thing in our brains called the firefly mode, and that's usually used to describe how someone reacts to situations, especially under pressure. There's a lot of like studies people do. Like if someone goes through a natural disaster or things like that, they do like studies for that. There's actually a few documentaries on Netflix about it that are really, really cool. But anyways, but basically, if your firefly mode is like active, that means that you're living in survival mode, because that is only activated, like I said, like people study that with people that have gone through natural disasters and have survived, or like a big accident, or something, like they were like that they really had to survive. They physically had to survive. But what happens to most of us nowadays is that our fight or flight response, it's active all the time, because most of us are living in survival mode. Even though there's nothing actually endangering our lives, we feel like we're fighting to survive constantly. And you can really get anywhere if you're feeling like that, because if you're spending all of your energy protecting yourself and like protecting your body and like bracing for chaos and like expecting things to go like sideways, how is anything good is actually gonna enter your life? The first thing you have to do is stabilize your nervous system. I have a few techniques that I like to use. I like to meditate. I like to do somatic yoga. If you don't know what that is, please go look it up. It's really nice. And I think that part of the reason why a lot of people get obsessed with signs during the manifestation process is because their nervous system is not stabilized. Like if you are dysregulated, you are constantly checking for signs, you go through emotional spirals, like I mentioned before, if you have a good day, your emotions and energy is stable. But if you have like a shitty day, like if something happens that like you were not expecting, then you spiral, then your life is over, then everything is shitty. And if you need proof all the time, because if you're constantly like looking for signs, is because you need to see proof, right? You need your 3D to show you that you have become something. And you usually confuse anxiety for alignment, and a real embodiment is actually, when you start feeling calmer, when you start to feel like everything is okay and that you just have to keep going and that you don't actually need anyone to tell you and you don't really need to see signs. That's when it's coming. And I'm gonna give like another personal, like story here, because like I said, I am going through this and I feel like right now I am exactly in this phase. I am working on like my nervous system, and I really am trying to open myself up to my intuition and really like listening to the guidance I receive, because I think that like, if we allow ourselves to listen, if we are able to, you know, l- get the volume of everything else a little bit lower and we get to a state where we're really aligned with ourselves, we just have to listen, and if we trust what we're hearing, that's when magic happens. And I think I mentioned this in the other episode as well. This podcast is definitely something that, it's a project that I'm really enjoying working on, but there's no guarantees. But I know that part of my path is to share, and that's what I'm doing. Like, I've had signs when I've had confirmation from my 3D reality, so I was like, okay, let me try. And even though like nothing is happening, I feel like a lot of things are unfolding. So I guess we're all gonna have to stay tuned for that. And then I think that like the last step of the process is this like quieter, alignment. And the thing is, I used to think alignment would feel intense and euphoric all the time, but sometimes it actually feels really quiet. And it really does, because it gets to a point where like everything is already set in motion, so there's nothing left to do. And usually this phase we feel like we can feel the possibilities, we can feel that we are in the right direction. There's less emotional force. I'm not really trying to feel anything anymore. I am acting like the person that I want to be. I'm not chasing anymore. Like before, I felt like I had to keep my desires, like active all the time, in that I had to like chase them or have them like present. And I'm not doing that anymore. Like the I don't chase, I attract. Whatever is meant for me will find me. That is working. There's a point where you actually feel that underneath, and you have more, internal certainty, and you're just living your life without panicking. Because when you are certain about your path and about who you are, you don't need your external reality to mirror that back to you right away. You know, I feel like I've recently like closed the chapter, an internal chapter of who I was, and now I am stabilizing this new identity. And I think that, things are working out because, like I said, now I am acting differently. I am looking at possibilities differently. I am taking action. And even though like there's nothing solid just yet, I am building my own path. I think I'm opening myself up to more possibilities and more support, and I think that also I am allowing support to come to me, because sometimes we want something so desperately, but we are so closed off to receiving that there's no way for that desire to come to you. So I think that like really opening yourself up to the world is something that it's really good to keep in mind, because when you are in transition, when you are changing, and when things are unstable for many people, and I know for me at least, I really was trying to protect myself and protect my energy. But because I was protecting myself so much, nothing was really able to come through, because I was like so closed off. And now I feel like I'm finally opening myself up again. I am softening a little bit. But it's not easy, because when you're when you've been going through like all these battles, internal and external, like, when there's no more fighting and you just have to let it be, like it's strange at first, but it's also a really calming feeling at the end of the day, like, and this inner deep knowing is something that, like, it's like this fire inside of you. It's so strange because like I have no idea, like what's gonna happen for me, but I do know that if I keep this mindset, if I keep my actions aligned, I know that things are gonna work out for me. And I think that, like, if you are going through this, keep going, because I know that um especially when you're just starting to be in this in between phase, like there's a lot of doubts, and you really don't know what's going on. And I think that's why I wanted to make an episode about this, because when you are in it but you don't know much about it, like it can feel really overwhelming. Like it can feel like you're drowning almost, and one day you're happy, you're fine, and then the other is like everything is, it's all down the drain. And if you are going through this, I know it's hard, but stay strong, and really just keep going. Stop changing direction so much, like choose something and stick with it, and work on that long enough for it to be able to give yourself something. Like, if you keep changing directions all the time, nothing is gonna be able to grow enough for you to receive what you planted. So just keep watering your garden, because if you do, before you know it, you're gonna be seeing flowers. And to end this episode, I just wanted to leave you guys with this. You don't have to emotionally carry your future into existence through force. Maybe you just have to keep choosing yourself before the external confirmation arrives. Thank you guys so much for sticking to the end of this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching if you're on YouTube. It's amazing to be here, and I hope to see you guys next time. Thank you.